I think, I mean, Mac will probably recognise this title. It's actually taken from an American book, and yeah, I suppose it's a bit of, I suppose it's a bit ironic because it's the simple act of planting a tree. The actual putting the tree in the ground is the very simple bit. It's the bit that's everything before that is the slightly more complex bit when you think about all the different aspects that you have to think about. So we'll sort of start to work our way through those today. So we're going to start off with see if we can get them go. So there we go. So first bit, I suppose, is why do we want to plant trees? Well, we're all tree wardens here in this group today, so we've obviously got an affinity with trees, and you know, one of the things that tree wardens do, and lots of other people want to do, is plant trees because they want to do something around enhancing biodiversity or increasing canopy cover or providing air cooling, to add visual interest to a garden space or landscape through the seasons. Other reasons might be to create an orchard for a source of fruit or nuts, if you're particularly into that kind of use of, you know, growing a productive landscape. For us as local authority tree officers, and for people who manage large parks and gardens, you might want to be thinking about providing successional trees in the landscape. So you've got a nice mature landscape. Those trees might be, I don't know, you know, getting towards the latter years of their life expectancy, and you want to make sure that you've got trees that retain that landscape feel going forward. So you have to think probably 30, 40, 50 years ahead sometimes to think about what's going to replace those trees coming through. The other bits that we've got on there was we talked about providing resilience to pests and diseases through diversifying the tree stock, and that's something we've spoken about before, especially within the city where we've got all of our trees out across the highways, in parks. We know that there are pests and diseases coming forward that might impact some of those trees. So we've got ash dieback at the moment, and if we think about ash on the highway, they make up that, well, they were making up about 10% of all the trees on the highway. So, you know, we want to make sure that we don't lose that amount of stock when anything else comes through. Anything else might come forward. So what can we do to try and think about what we can provide that might be resistant to future pest diseases, and also changes in climate as well. Other things that you'll see trees being pushed for in terms of their benefits to the environment are things like to slow water flow as well. So planting trees along riverback, you know, river edges, woodland planting along their hedgerow plantings. So when water does burst out of the banks of those streams and rivers, that slow is actually flowed down. They hold back some of that water and minimize the risk of flooding further downstream. So that's the slowing the flow. And of course, the trees will help increase water infiltration as well. So just through their roots going through the soil, they create air pockets, or as they move through the soil, they will sort of break up that soil structure a bit. There'll be those air pockets that the water can infiltrate into, and of course they take up some of that water at the same time. So a number of different reasons why we might want to plant trees there. If we think about where to plant trees, obviously that relates directly to many of the reasons as to why we would want to plant trees. So that is partially answered. We want to slow the flow. We've got to plant trees where we have incidences of flooding, or where water might be flowing over the water surface. Where we've got, if we want to use them for urban air cooling, then we need to be planting them in areas where we've got high urban heat island effect, that residual heat that it remains throughout the day and night. But it may be that you have some data as well to help you identify locations. So has an iTree canopy assessment or similar been undertaken? You know, we've got our canopy cover maps for the city, so we can see that some parts of Birmingham have got, you know, maybe sort of 49, 50% canopy cover, but other areas of the city around the city centre, Lascelles, Nechells, Digbeth, Borsley, Highgate, might be as low as 9 or 10% canopy cover. So that's an area that perhaps we might want to focus on in terms of, can we get additional trees? You know, what can we actually plant in those areas? Do we have the information on tree species so that we can identify whether there are existing or potential threats to trees from pests and diseases? So that's where understanding what's in your local area comes in. You know, do you have a lot of a particular type of tree? Some parts of the UK have, you know, quite extensive ash woodlands, and so therefore, you know, they're losing quite significant numbers of trees. What can be replaced? What can be planted to replace those? And of course, we have to think about who the landowner is and who will have the responsibility for the tree going forwards as well. So for us, we're able to work with the city council and plant on council land, but we can also work with others as well. We might be able to work with Bourneville Village Trust or Calthorpe Estates or Canals and Rivers Trust, anybody else who really has land that might be able to be planted on. There are lots of people out there at the moment trying to plant trees and trying to work with landowners, so it's a bit of a competitive area, but hopefully there's plenty of space for everybody. But there are still a number of other factors to be considered as well in there. So we've already covered a little bit of this earlier in the year when we were looking at about assessing sites for tree planting. So if you remember back, those of you who attended that session, if you remember back, we were talking about, does the site have any designation that might influence the tree choice? So if we were thinking about some of the areas in Birmingham, we've got Handsworth Park and Bramwood Cemetery that are that are registered parks and gardens, historic landscapes. So that might require us to think about particular trees to be in keeping with that period, or to maintain that landscape view or that feel. Are there underground services? So we did mention about things like gas and electricity and phone cabling, all those types of things that are buried services. And again, we also find electrical cables above ground as well. So overhead pylons, cabling from telegraph wire poles, where you're connecting houses to the electric system. Proximity to street furniture as well. So when we talk about street furniture, we're thinking of things like street lights, traffic signs, traffic lights as well. So we don't want to be planting trees that might obscure the view of those, or if we are planting near those, we want to make sure that we've got a tree form or shape that is going to grow up and around that and that maintain that visibility. Again, proximity to built structures. So for some parts of the city, subsidence may be an issue. So we know that we've got pockets of shrinkable clay throughout the city, stretching really from sort of Bourneville to diagonally northeast through the city, heading out through to Shard End and beyond. So we do have to think about, within those areas, what sort of trees might we be planting. I mean, it's a bit hit and miss. There's only pockets of this shrinkable clay, so it's hard to say that this particular area is going to be heavily impacted, unlike somewhere like Hull or places in London, which have vast expanses of shrinkable clay. And then think about things like, is it going to provide direct damage or shading? So shading might be really beneficial in terms of reducing the overheating of a house in the summer. It might also reduce or filter the cold northerly winds in the winter. So that'd be beneficial. But it also might be that if it's too shaded of a property on rooms that are inhabited for much of the day, people might need to have the lights on more often, or need to have the heating on to warm the room up. So there's an implication there for potential energy usage, which we all know is a bit of an issue at the moment. And then things like fruit as well. So there's a lot of drive for people to plant fruit trees, and they talk about wanting to plant them alongside the roads. But we do see it with things like the horse chestnuts. You get all the fruit, the nuts falling on the road, which is not too bad. But if you're getting things like apples and pears and plums falling on pavements, and if they're not regularly cleaned up, you might get a number of wasps. It might be slippy. So again, we have to think about what the implications of those are. So in large grass verges, in parks, etc., fruit trees are usually pretty good. But in hard landscape spaces, fruit trees are perhaps not the species to be being looked at. So yeah, again, if we're looking at hard or soft landscaping, we might need to be considering how that sort of rooting pattern or the rooting type, are the trees that we're looking at particularly shallow rooted? If we're planting something like say a birch tree, which would be very shallow rooted, or some of the acers alongside a footway that's either blockwork or slabs, that shallow rooting might start to lift those slabs quite quickly, especially if they're exploiting the moisture between the slab and the base layer, and that's going to cause might cause more of a trip hazard. So we can think about trees that are might be a little bit more deeper rooted or not have such shallow rooting, and that might avoid some of those issues. Availability of soil, what volume can be expected as well. So if we're looking at putting a tree into a very hard landscape, have we got sufficient soil to sustain a big tree there, or should we be thinking about putting something smaller in place? And kinematic envelope as well. So the kinematic envelope, that's the space that the vehicles are taking up on the highway, and includes the amount of movement that they have. So if the body of a lorry sways from side to side slightly, so we want to try and make sure we keep those areas clear. So again, thinking about trees that might either be tall and narrow, or will have sufficient growth to be able to put the branches up and over the top of the highway is quite good. So if you're driving along places like Alton Boulevard or Bristol Road, where we've got those avenues of trees, you'll see that the trees are growing quite tall inside. The branches are arching up and over the top. We've got 6 meters clearance over the highway there, which is sufficient for buses and articulated lorries. So we don't always have to plant columnar trees. We can prune trees if they're of sufficient size up and over there. So what trees to plant? So if you're planting in a location that is set aside for wildlife or as a nature conservation designation, so within Birmingham we've got lots of sites that have either what we call SINC or SLINC status. So SINC stands for Site of Importance for Nature Conservation, and SLINC is the same, but it's of local importance. Then we might be looking primarily at trees that are native, trees and shrubs that are native, that have that wildlife value as a main benefit from them. In other locations, though, we can be pretty much looking at anything within the more ornamental range and non-native range, plus broadleaf or conifer trees as well. So we need to be mixing those up to provide differences in visual aesthetics, in terms of providing some all year round greening. It might be early or either winter interest because of bark or form, or it could be spring interest through leaves, or autumn interest through that colour, summer interest through flowering. There's all sorts of things that we could be looking at there. And just because the tree is non-native, we do see this a lot. A lot of people sort of campaigning and saying we should be only planting native tree species. And while we've already said that that's potentially a good idea, or that is a good idea in those high conservation sites, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not of any value to wildlife if they are non-native. There are plenty of flowering and fruiting species out there that are beneficial. We think about, people would think about planting a horse chestnut, but not necessarily think about the fact that that's not a native species. It does have a benefit for bees as well. So, as a pollinating plant, it's quite good. Fruit trees, for those of you who have been involved in doing any orchard planting, will understand that it can be sort of, I suppose, quite confusing if you're looking at what fruit trees to plant, because not only is there huge choice of modern varieties and heritage varieties, but you need to choose the appropriate rootstock. So thinking about what the ultimate size of the tree is going to be, I'll come to that in a little bit, and consider if the trees are self-fertile or if they're diploid or triploid. So do they need to be cross-pollinated, or does it actually require 3 different species, 3 different varieties in order to get that full pollination? So you have to think about what you're going to plant, or what else are you going to pair it with. Have you got other fruit trees in the area that might act as that pollinator source, or do you need to provide those as well? So that's about mixing up what you're planting. So selecting trees. So this is something that obviously we have to think about a lot in terms of what we're going to do when we're looking at our planting programs. So trees tend to come in sort of 3 different forms, or 3 different I suppose 3 different types. First one's a bare-rooted tree. So that's the one on the left of the picture there. So those trees have been lifted from the soil. They've got the roots exposed. They'll generally be supplied to you in a plastic bag with the roots encapsulated there and tied up, and that's sealed in. You might get them as a single tree, so you can get sort of larger trees, so the sort of standard size, maybe 6-7 feet or a bit more, supplied as bare rooted. But generally we're looking at whips, so the seedling trees that have been maybe growing for 1, 2 or 3 years in a nursery. So you've got quite a small straight stem, maybe a few side branches and the bare roots on there. So that's the whip planting. We use those primarily for things like our woodland plantings and hedgerow plantings, because they're small, easy to handle, they're easy for people to plant. You can get those, you can get quite a lot in the area that you need to. So if we're looking at hedgerow planting, we get quite a dense planting in those. They are, if you're growing these planting these as a standard, they will need staking for to support them a bit longer than maybe something that's containerized or root ball, because they don't have any sort of bulk of soil around the base to help stabilize them. The next one across, it says balled and burlapped. I mean, that's a bit more of an American phrase. We would talk about trees being root balled, but it's basically the same system. Within the tree nursery production, they'll have a machine with sort of four or more big sort of spades around the edge, which surrounds the tree, digs into the ground and undercuts the tree, slices through the roots to create a ball with lots of fibrous rooting in there and the soil. When that's lifted, that's all wrapped up in hessian, and then either with a string binding or more usually a wire mesh binding. That's all held together, and you can plant them almost as they are, but you should really open out the wiring at the top, cut much of that away, but leave the hessian in place. They are quite difficult to handle though, so if you're looking at sort of extra heavy standard trees or standard trees, that root ball on the base is quite awkward, so you tend to need specialist handling equipment to move those trees around. The final one is containerized or container grown trees. So there's two different sorts there, I suppose. You've got container grown trees that have been grown in containers continually for a number of years, probably more than 3 or 4. They might have been open grown to start off with, put in a pot, and then grown in a container, and then moved into a bigger size pot and a bigger size pot as you go. Containerized trees, though, we often have those. So they're the ones you might see our highways teams planting, which come in either a woven bag with handles on. Those trees tend to have been field grown for a while and then put into one of those bags and then watered and fed for maybe a year or 2 years to establish the root system. They are, in those carry bags, they are very much easier to handle, but you still probably need maybe 2 people on most of those, because a standard size tree, you're looking at maybe something like 45 kilos for a root ball tree, so not the lightest of things. In thinking about selecting trees, again, budget is always going to be a big thing, isn't it, to think about. So how much money have you got to buy trees with? If like us, you're a community organisation, a charitable group, this is really a big factor in what you can deliver as part of any planting programme. So we know that we can bid into a number of different organisations like the Woodland Trust, who are doing tree giveaways, but they've had to raise the money for those originally. If we go through the types that we were looking at, we've got the bare-rooted whips and fruit trees. So they could be anything from like 35p for a whip, so that's maybe a 60 to 90 centimetre tall tree, something that's readily grown from seed. And then the fruit trees, which take longer and will have been grafted onto a rootstock, they're probably from £10 up, well, maybe sort of £7 to £10 upwards. You can get some quite cheap ones through from places like Lidl and Aldi. But if you want more unusual varieties, then people like Frank Matthews down in Tenbury Wells have got a huge array of both heritage varieties and more sort of recent types, so like Discovery and Brayburn and all those. But yeah, so the pros and cons, we've already mentioned a little bit of that there. Relatively cheap, light and easy to handle. Smaller trees can establish quickly with less input. You would be planting these in the dormant season only, so you can only plant those during the winter months. If you're going to be having a delivery, they really need to be unpacked and healed in, so put either into a temporary planting bed of either compost or something similar to that, and kept moist if you're not planting directly after delivery. And again, we've said those are great for hedges and woodland plantings, new orchards and gardens. The root ball trees, we're going sort of from maybe £10 through to the hundreds, depending on the size of those. So the smaller fruit trees, going through up to the mature trees, often field grown, like we said, larger size than the bare rooted. You probably want to be looking at the specification that they were produced as well. So you're looking for something that's been undercut at least 3 times during its production to stimulate that fine root growth. Great for parks and gardens and places that need that instant impact, which is why we're using those sorts of trees on the highway and in parks, because they give that they do give that instant impact, but they are also a little bit more resistant to some of the incidental vandalism. The bare rooted whips, people can just pull those straight out the ground. The root ball trees we do, and containerized trees, we do get people snap them off. We have had people pull them out of the ground, but they're probably less likely to be uprooted than anything else. And the containerized trees are the same again. It depends on what you're looking for there, but they can be up to thousands of pounds if you're looking for a really big mature tree that's grown. But again, maybe in a landscape scheme, that's what you want. And things like containerized trees, they can actually be planted any time of the year. But if you're planting in the summer, you really need to be on that watering right from the moment it's delivered. Really, you can't be letting that root ball dry out at all. If you let it dry out, then you'll start to get some root dieback on there, and the tree will suffer quite quickly from that. So very, very key to keep on top of the watering if you're looking at summer planting. And why is my screen not advancing? There we go. So when we talk about sizes, I did mention this a little bit. We've got whips are usually described by centimetres in height, and in a broad range, they're either something like 20 to 40 centimetres, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, or 60 to 90 centimetres. So that's the height in centimetres. That's generally including the root ball as well, all the roots on there. And like I said, we tend to be planting 40 to 60s or 60 to 80s, just because they're a bit more visible when we've planted them out in parks. If you're looking at getting the free trees from people like the Woodland Trust, you might find that you get trees at the smaller end because they're sending them through the post. So if you're just having a small number, it could be an idea to maybe grow them on a little bit over the course of a year or so before you plant them out, or make sure that you've got a clearly defined area and marked out where you've put those trees, because if somebody else is coming around mowing, they can be very easily overlooked, especially if they're at that sort of 20 centimetre height end. That's not very tall at all. The fruit trees, you have those described as things like maidens, which are a single stem off the base of the rootstock. Bush will have side branches on those, cordons, half standards, straight leads, and standards. There's all different forms that are produced, and depending on what you want and how quickly you want it to be producing fruit, you might choose something that's had a bit more work put into it. So with the maiden tree, it might seem a bit harsh, but quite often you'll need to take the top out at some point in order to produce the side branches and get that sort of more vase shape that you might need for fruit production. So you're going to have to put a bit more thought into pruning and work. In terms of the sort of containerized and root ball trees, that image down the bottom left-hand corner there, that gives an indication of the sort of size and range of trees that you can buy. So if we go from right to left in that picture there, the 14, 16 centimeters. Now, instead, we've gone from describing tree height to describing tree girth. And those of you that are doing the street tree survey or have done any of the tree survey work with us will know that normally you talk about the diameter of the trunk at breast height, but in nursery production, it's the girth, so the circumference around the stem. So 14 to 16 centimeters, that's about the sort of size that we would normally be planting on the highways and out in parks. They're about the limit that you can easily handle, one person can easily handle to move around in the park space, or from the back of a lorry or truck out into the planting location. They're still coming in at sort of maybe 4 meters tall, so 4 meters as well, 12, 14 feet in height. The cost of those varies depending on the speed of growth, so that depends on the species. So slow growing species, if you want something that size, it's going to be more expensive than a tree that's growing quicker. The 20 to 25s is something that you might see us planting out on the highways, especially if we've just been doing a complete new road layout. We'll put something with a bit more impact on. And then the big sort of like the bigger trees there, the 30 to 35s, 40 45s, and the 70s to 80s. I mean, those are if you're doing really high quality public realm landscapes and you want a real instant impact, but you're going to have to put a lot of, it's going to cost you a lot of money to buy them. You're going to have specialist equipment to move them there. You can see that 70 to 80 centimetre one there. It's got that sort of forklift truck underneath the roof ball. So you're going to need something like that to move around. And you're going to have to do an awful lot of watering in the early years as well to support the amount of canopy that is on that tree there. But these are all, as you can see, single stem trees. They've probably got a clear stem of about 2 meters or more. So that's 2 meters from the ground to the first branch. Now you have to forgive the blurriness of this slide. It's not the connection, it is actually the slide. I've tried to find a really high quality resolution of this image and haven't been able to find a better one. But this is taken from the Frank Matthews stock book for their fruit trees, and it gives you an indication there of just the types of rootstock and what that does for the trees. So the rootstock is the thing that's going to limit the ultimate size of the tree. So you might have the top half of a tree, or that would produce a certain type of fruit that would normally be very vigorous and would be too big for a space, but you want that type of fruit. So you can produce a smaller tree by using a different type of rootstock that dwarfs it, I suppose. So here we've got trees that are what we call very dwarf. So those would be things like apples typically, and that'll be on a rootstock called M27. And you can see from the sort of the height of the tree there, that's the one on the left-hand side, that you'll be looking at something around 1 to 2 meters. So for a small garden space where you're going to be picking those, you'll be able to collect the apples from the ground. You're not going to have to use ladders to climb and get the trees, get the fruit, or anything like that. Moving through to the dwarfing rootstock, that's usually available for things like apples and pears and cherries. And interesting there, you'll see that the rootstock for the pear is called Quince C, and then the cherries Gisela 5. So there's loads and loads of different rootstocks out there. There really are. Those trees will be maybe 2 to 3 meters tall, and we're moving through to semi-dwarf, medium, semi-vigorous, vigorous, and very, very vigorous. So things on that end there, I mean, those very vigorous trees, you might be thinking things like wild pear, for example, would be in the very vigorous end. It would be on its native rootstock, and it may reach 30, 40 feet in height overall. So not the sort of tree that you could plant in a small domestic garden. Great for wildlife, great for park spaces and those open areas. So if you're looking for something that's big, look for something with a vigorous or very, very vigorous rootstock. But if you want to collect the fruit, you're probably either going to be having to use ladders or only be collecting the fallen fruit from that. Of course, with all these things, biosecurity and plant health is essential. So when buying trees, we need to think about where we're getting those from. Can we obtain UK grown trees, or does the company have a robust phytosanitary or sanitation policy and quarantine process in place? I know that for Birmingham, our first instance of things like ash dieback was when we had some ash trees come in. We'd specified that we wanted UK native stock, which is exactly what we got. We did get UK native stock, but what they failed to tell us was that they'd actually taken seed from the UK, exported it to Holland, grew them in Holland for 2 or 3 years, and then imported the trees back again. So with that came the ash dieback. It was already out there in the country. We weren't responsible for bringing it in, but it just meant that it now turned up in a location where it hadn't previously been. So that was most frustrating. We managed to trace back where the tree stock had come from, and it was also then able to inform where else that tree stock had gone. So we knew that there were issues elsewhere that could be dealt with. But I mean, unfortunately, it's too widespread across the UK to do anything about it now. But, what we don't want to do is we don't want to bring anything else in. So things like oak processionary moth, we've got to think about where trees are coming from there. There are a few nurseries in the UK now that can't export oak trees outside of their quarantined area because they've got OPM. So we have to be looking for oak trees that are being grown outside of those quarantine areas. Just to give a quick indication, I think we've used this slide before. We're talking about pests and diseases and talking about the numbers that have been arriving over the years. And so we can see that if we look back from 1905, maybe through to 1945, 1950, we had very few very few introductions there. Between that 1900 and 1950, there were less than 10 introductions of pests and diseases. But for some, like where we think about this, from 2000 to 2015, what's that there? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There was 16 new pests and diseases in those 20, well, in those years there, from sort of like the late 1990s through to 2015. So a huge increase of things. And there are thousands of pests and diseases being added to the register every month. But not all of those are harmful, but they could be, I suppose, in time. So tree species selection. So we've gone through a whole host of other stuff about why do we want to plant trees, where do we want to plant trees, what types of trees we can plant, or what form they're going to be delivered to us in. We've also got to think about what that species selection is. We have mentioned about natives and non-natives, but there's loads of information out there. We've already said about Frank Matthews' guide for fruit trees. Other companies are available, but they are a particularly good one. The Trees and Design Action Group also have this online tree species selection guide for green infrastructure, a guide for specifiers, which is really useful. It has a PDF guide, and there is also a Excel spreadsheet for those who like Excel spreadsheets. It doesn't have all the pretty pictures in, but it does help you quickly limit down types of trees that you might want to be looking at. So this is a front page from within that TDAG guide, and you can see we've got use potential, mature size, crown form, crown density, natural habitat, environmental tolerance, ornamental qualities, and issues to be aware of. So within that PDF guide, you can actually jump to a selection of trees. So if you decide actually we want to look at trees that are useful for a park space or for SUDs, so sustainable urban drainage, or for a small garden, it will sort of shortlist out a number of trees, and you can work through those. The environmental tolerance, I think, is quite useful as well, looking at the tolerance to shade and the tolerance to drought as well, or waterlogging. Interesting thing about trees for SUDS situations. So if we think about how we might be designing our built environment to be resilient against climate change, we might be thinking about putting rain gardens in that will take some of that storm water and hold it there and slowly release it out into the drains or the rivers over a period of time. We can plant trees into there, and you would think that because they get inundated with water that we need trees that are particularly tolerant to waterlogging. But actually, for much of the year, they might be quite dry places. So actually, you need trees that will be quite tolerant to drought. So finding trees that are moderately tolerant to drought and moderately tolerant to waterlogging are probably the best ones to be looking at for sustainable urban drainage systems, and not ones that are capable of being waterlogged through much of the year. So trees that particularly might grow next to a watercourse might not be that suitable to put in a SUD system because they need that damper environment. The issue to be aware of could be anything. It could be to do with the fact that they have really shallow rooting, or they have lots of foul-smelling fruit. So things like some of the female ginkgos do. Could be a wide range of things there. Sometimes you might find things that have got slightly sort of could be slightly toxic as well. There are some species of trees that have toxins in leaves and stuff. So yeah. Here's an example of one from the guide. So this is Lebanese wild apple, Milas trilobata. Trilobata, yeah, it's not related to trilobites, which I was about to say, but it's like 3 lobes on the leaf. This is useful for parks, small gardens, paved areas. It's a medium tree, capable of reaching 15 meters. But you can see it's got a conical crown as well, so slightly wider at the base, coming up to a point, rather than being sort of either broader, shallower crown or quite columnar. Tolerant to shade, moderately tolerant to drought. So good, quite a good urban tree. Has white flowers, deciduous, does occasionally have some fruit that persists into the winter, and is ornamental. But again, you remember I mentioned about the fruit litter. So it says fruit litter may cause an issue on paved sites. So there's an example of the issues there. So now we get on to the bit where we're going to talk about, which was how to plant the tree. So depending on the type of tree that you're going to be planting, there's a number of different methods of planting those trees. If we're thinking about bare-rooted trees or trees that are root balled or containerized, we need to be digging a fairly reasonably sized pit in order to put that tree into. With the containerized trees, you can actually just, if your soil's not too compacted, so if you go into a nice soft landscape area where the soil's not too compacted, you can actually just almost dig sufficient space for the containered growth to go into the tree and into the ground, sorry. And that is one of the ways that you can sort of minimize the visual changes of the fact that you put trees in the landscape. One of the things that attracts vandalism is the fact that people can see something's been done. So trees with tree stakes, lots of freshly dug soil, all those sorts of things are signs that something's been happening. If a tree just appears in a grassy space and it doesn't look like there's been any digging there, people do overlook them. So they do get left alone a bit like that. And the big thing really is about how you avoid the movement of the root ball. But we're going to just go on the basis that we're digging this large pit. There might be a bit more compacted soil around it. So we're going to look at the root ball, and we're going to make a pit that's probably 2 to 3 times the widest part of that root ball, or certainly beyond the extent of any of the bare root areas. We're going to excavate that hole out. There's lots of debate as to whether people want to dig a square hole or a round hole. I don't think it really matters a huge amount. If the soil is suitable, the roots can get out into the surrounds from there. If you can, you could dig it in sort of a bit more of a saucer shape, or a bowl shape, so it's sloping sides. It doesn't really matter, I suppose, but it does make that digging a little bit easier if you've got these sort of sloping sides. You need to make sure that the hole is deep enough that when the roots or the root ball is resting on the bottom and the soil is backfilled, that the nursery line. So if I can I annotate the slide? I don't know. So here, the nursery line would be the area in which the tree was planted in the nursery. That needs to be at or above the level of the soil. We don't want that below the ground, because that's a way that things like phytophthora rots will get into the tree. Doesn't like that nursery line being buried. We want to make sure that the root flare or where the root flare will be coming from is above ground. If the soil surrounding it is slightly more waterlogged, it's actually okay to plant the tree a little bit higher, so that you've got the nursery line a bit higher than surrounding ground, but definitely not lower. We start to backfill the ground around the tree, little layer at a time, compacting that down, not absolutely ramming it down, just sufficient to be firm and hold the tree in place, building up as we go. You'll find that if you're planting especially if you're planting a root ball tree, you'll probably have some soil spare. So one of the things I like to do is what they've done here, which is to make this little raised lump at the edge of the rooting area. You'll make almost like a donut sort of shape around the outside of the tree. So if you are just watering from the surface when you're coming in, you're putting the water into this space here, and this acts as like a little dam to hold the water, stops it just running off the surface. The other thing then to do is to put a mulch layer around it if you can. Sometimes the soil and the digging is sufficient. You can maintain that's a fairly weed-free area, but mulching helps retain more of the moisture in the soil. It prevents some of that surface evaporation. And you're probably looking at a layer of maybe, maybe I don't know, 2 to 3 inches or so You can mulch a little bit further in towards the trunk, but don't mulch up the trunk of this. What we want is a space. Even if you to mulch into here, you'd probably come to maybe like that there, so it tapers out. What we don't want is what you see sometimes, which will be, and we talk about this, we say donuts, not volcanoes. Where's my pencil gone now? Can't find my pencil there. Ooh. So you'll see pictures where people have mulched trees and it looks like this. So we don't want that. We definitely want this ring around the outside. So that's where the moisture is needed most, at the outer edges where these fibrous roots are going to be, retaining the moisture out here. Right. Ooh. Close that there. So I think we've gone through there. Loosened soil, sloping sides. Yeah, if you're planting in clay soils as well, you might find that as you're using the spade, this gets sort of smeared and shiny. So if that does happen, you need to just roughen that up, because otherwise what happens is you end up with basically you've created a clay pot in which the tree will sit. That will hold the water. And if you're holding water within here, you get these anaerobic conditions in here because it's too wet, it's not free draining, and you'll get root death. If it's very wet, you can actually dig out underneath the tree a little bit and backfill with either a sharp sand or a gravel fill, or make a slight mound up underneath the tree that sits on, just to hold that root ball out of the heavy waterlogged area to start off with. Right, there we go, next one. So if we're planting something like a whip, though, the planting style is completely different. And there are, I suppose, 3 main methods of planting whip trees. Sometimes you'll see, if you're doing a large woodland planting site, somebody might have taken all the grass away. They might have either sprayed that out or turf stripped or ploughed it. One of the things we used to do within Birmingham would be actually to use something called a mole plough, which runs a groove or a slit through the ground, and that allows, that sort of breaks up the soil, and it makes it much easier, especially for small kids to be planting trees. We can start out by marking out the area that you are going to plant into. You might decide that actually you want to mark the locations of all your trees. If you're doing a woodland planting and you're going to be putting 1,500 trees in, it's not going to be easy to mark the locations of everyone. So maybe just the outer edges of where you want to go. And then we've got these sort of 3 particular styles. So pit planting, if we're going down to the bottom left-hand side, that's basically you take your spade, and you've got the metal spit at the bottom, and so you do 4 cuts to take out the square, and that creates your pit that you're going to plant into. You might put your tree in one corner of that pit or in the center of the pit and break up the soil, put that back around the roots, trying to make sure that you've got the nursery line above at the ground level, and then you firm the soil back in around it. That's quite handy. It's quite a good way of doing things, but it's a bit more time consuming, especially if you've got if you've got a lot to do. It does work well on very firm ground though, because where you can't actually break open the ground, as in the next 2 methods. So slit planting is the second one. So there we're pushing the spade fully into the ground, and you push it forwards and backwards to create a slit in the ground. This works well for the smaller whips, where you've got a slightly smaller root mass with them. Once you've got the slit open, you can insert the tree into that area, and then just remove the spade and push the soil back around the tree. And then if you're using guards, fit the guard as you would do with the pit planting. So we don't tend to use guards in Birmingham. We don't have lots of rabbits and deer, so we don't need to protect from browsing in that respect. The last one though, which is T-notch planting, is actually probably my favorite method of planting whips, because it's quick, it's simple, it works well on softer ground. So you start by putting the spit into the ground. I just realised there's a bit of red marking on there on the screen as well. Get rid of that. You put the spit into the ground, and make this sort of slot. You make this first longitudinal cut here. Then you take the spade and you go to make this second one. So as you're looking at it, it'd actually be an upside down capital T. Okay, so it's at right angles and halfway across. Then you pull the spade back, and as you do that, it sort of hinges the two pieces open on each side, here and here. Then you can insert the roots almost onto the spit of the spade with the stem between the two blocks. And as you lever the spade back upright again, you can just with it will tend to fall back into place, but those two blocks of soil fall back into the ground, pulling the roots down, and you can just firm that in around it. It is a really quick method, and like I say, it works very well in areas where you've got a deeper topsoil layer and the soil is a bit softer. If you've got very hard compacted soils, then the pit planting is probably the best option to go with. Next slide. There we go. If we're looking at hedging, these should be planted in 2 staggered rows, and we've got them here probably about 40 centimeters apart, thereabouts, and then roughly about the same between plants in the row. So we're looking at 5 plants per meter, and then yeah, so we've got just a double staggered row. So start one, so maybe 400 million from the start of a row, and then the other one maybe 200 million, and then work through that process all the way along, mixing your species as you go along. The density of the planting should be, and distances between the plants should be specified in the hedgerow scheme details if you're doing that there. Veronica, you may recognise this picture. This is the jam hedge that we put in at Fox Holly's Rec. So we did a planting along this wall here. So the hedgerow that we were putting in there, we were putting in a sort of a fruit and nut jam hedge. So it was species that were going to produce nuts or berries that could be used for jam. And then you can see we've sort of got this cultivated area along the length there, and we were using locals from the Scouts and Cobs to come and actually plant that hedgerow. So really good activity. And I think that's doing quite well now, isn't it, from what you said there a little while back. So yeah, nodding there. If we need to secure newly planted trees, particularly standard trees, then there are a number of different methods that we can do this if we need to. Like I say, whips, you probably don't need to put any kind of fastening on them to hold them in place. If you do use a cane or a stake, it's usually about providing a guard to stop either damage or from browsing or from cutting the grass around it or spraying. They also create a little bit of a microclimate in there, so it does sort of help speed up the growth a bit. It acts like a mini greenhouse. But as you might have seen, if you've seen the big Forestry Commission style plantings, there's often lots of plastic out there in the countryside. Those guards do break down, but you end up with lots of microplastics out there. There are other guards now that you can get, which are a combination of sheep's wool and oils from the pistachio and cashew nut industry. So they are totally biodegradable. They are 100% biodegradable. It's all natural materials. So if you're looking to use some sort of guard on whip planting, then something along that style is quite good. There are some cardboard ones as well, but they tend to go a bit soggy after a while. But looking at the staking, so there's different methods here, or fixing different methods. So there are things like single stakes, double stakes. You might see triple staking on some of our trees, or you've got things like guy ropes as well, which we did use on when we transplanted some trees from the old university site at Perry Bar out onto the Greenway at Sutton. There we were actually lifting trees that had been growing in the car park there, and so we needed a method of staking them or holding them upright while the tree roots established themselves. Stakes weren't going to be sufficient to hold that size of the tree, so we actually used a triple guy system there. Single stakes though, you can put the stake vertically, or as this one is here, it's actually at an angle. It allows you to get the tie a little bit lower down. And as we're saying, all of these here, the primary purpose of it is to try and minimize the movement of the root ball, the bit in the ground. So if you're thinking the roots are going to be moving out from the root mass as it is into surrounding soil, if that root ball rocks at all, and you've got roots that go out from the root ball into the soil, it'll actually shear them off. So that'll break those roots. That's why we don't want that. We want to make sure that's staying there. But we still want to try and get some movement at the top of the tree to provide that sort of stimulation of root growth and also thickening up of the lower stem. We've mentioned this before about we need to see building up of thickening of the stem at this lower edge, the lower extent, to get that root flare. That's the bit where all the strength is on the tree. This double staking here, that's probably a little bit high. We'd probably be looking at somewhere maybe about 2/3 of the height between the base and the first branches. But there we've got 2 stakes with, this is a flexible tie here. You will see trees that have been have a wooden crossbar and they're held back rigid against that crossbar. To be honest, I don't like that at all. They often get left on way too long, and there's limited room for the trunk to expand in size, and so you get these deformities in the trunk shape as they grow, as that's not been removed ahead of time. At least with flexible ties, if you're using something like a Hessian, then that will degrade over the next couple of years, and so therefore it'll be free of those ties. Or if it's rubber, there will be a little bit of stretch on there. Helen, I think Helen's on the call today. She was talking about planting or staking multi-stem trees. And multi-stem trees, where you've got lots of stems coming up from the ground, are quite difficult to stake. And actually, I suppose you could ask yourself, do you really need to stake those at all? If the upper growth isn't as top heavy as maybe a standard tree is, you've got the stems growing up from the base, do you need to stake it? It's probably not going to get that wind rock. If you're concerned that there may be a little bit of wind rock, or it may be something that you want to try and prevent somebody just picking the tree up and taking it away into the garden, there's a couple of methods here in these middle pictures. So we've got, this is one that we did, oh no, I don't think we actually did one. This is one that looks just like, heavens, just coming in. This looks how we did some of the trees at Cannon Hill Park. We didn't want to use stakes. We didn't really want to attract a huge amount of attention to the trees. This works really well for these root balled and containerized trees. This is just a bit of inch square or inch and a half square untreated timber. So you drive 4 stakes in with 2 crossbars that go over the root ball itself, and that holds that root ball in place really firmly. They're very simple to make. It's just a screw or a nail through at this end, each end, to hold that batten in place. You can buy or make metal versions of this as well. So this is a proprietary version, I think probably available from the States, which is using like a tubular structure, and this actually acts as a staple. So these are called these are ground staples. So you've got a longer stem that goes down into the ground each side of the root ball, and then the shorter piece that actually gets driven into the root ball itself to hold it in place. For much bigger trees, so when we were looking at those trees that were sort of 20-25s, 30-35s and upwards, then especially if they're going into a public realm area, then things like stakes are not necessarily going to be that desirable if you're looking at having hard paving around the outside. So this is where the underground guying systems come in, and these use what we call dead man's anchor, or you might use a ground screw into there, and then you have a series of cables or straps that come over the root ball and then are tensioned up to hold that in place. And that gives you quite a good system of stabilizing that root ball, stopping that moving around while having the tree unfettered of stakes. And you can then if you need to, put some kind of surfacing over the top or partially over the top of the root ball, leaving the soil volume underneath. So if you're going into the city centre and you go around Chamberlain Gardens, or you go around past the end of Great Western Arcade, Broad Street as well, where the new tree planting is occurring, this is the sort of system that's been used there. And of course, establishing newly planted trees is absolutely critical. This year we've just gone through such a dry, hot summer. that we need to make sure that we're on the ball with watering. Now, when we're planting thousands of trees, it's not easy to get round every tree as often as you need to if you change, if the weather pattern changes. So for the city, we've started a campaign now which is trying to help encourage people to water the trees out the front of their house. So you'll see that we've got our BTP logo on here. We've partnered with City Council and Kia to put these tags out to say, please water me. So we've got a little QR code that takes you to our web page as well. So yeah, if you're doing tree planting, you need to be thinking about how are we going to water these trees? Well, do we need to water the trees, and how are we going to water these trees, and how much are they going to be? How much water are they going to require? So trees on grass verges. Hopefully, if you could encourage local residents, that's just right outside the house, dead easy to get water out to them. That could be stuff that they've used for washing up. It could be rainwater that they've harvested. You know, okay, if you're a water meter, you probably don't want to use it straight out the tap, but you know, you can just use the tap water straight out there. And as a general rule, these sort of standard trees probably need about 50 litres of water a week in May, June, July, and August, so that main growing period. But as we've seen, I think this year it was quite dry from probably January, February time. So even those early months when you think the soil should be wet enough, we should be getting moisture, you know, we may need to be starting to think about watering earlier in the year to make sure there's some moisture in the soil available for that root growth early in the year. Can't remember what slides I've got to go now. I think, oh yes, I think it's just a couple to go. So this is woodland design. So just think about woodland plantings. Now, it's much better if we can have a more organic style of woodland planting block. The reason for that is what we're trying to create is an irregular edge that has areas that are protected from prevailing winds, that maybe attract with the stiller air will heat up earlier. So if you've got little sort of it's almost like it acts as a windbreak. So some species of insects and birds will be able to take advantage of those warmer areas in early in the year. So instead of having the traditional planting block like you would see for a commercial forest, where you've got a 10 by 10 or a 20 by 20 or 50 by 50 meter grid, and you've got a tree in every single hole, you want something a little bit more fluid, a little bit more open. So think about how, if you're going to be planting any woodland blocks, think about, can we get an irregular edge to that? It doesn't matter if you've laid it out to start off with as a square, but can we sort of go, actually, let's make a glade here. We're going to have a footway that comes through the block at this point here, you know. So we've got slightly denser plantings in some areas, so the trees are grouped together a little bit, and in other areas where they're actually about as far as possible apart in that same sort of grid style. Thinking about the tree species that are going into there as well, if you're planting things like oak and cherry and hazel and hawthorn, then think about, can you get some of the hazel and hawthorn on the woodland edge? Can you be thinking about putting the oaks and cherries towards the centre so you have this staggered effect? So in this bottom photo here, you've got this sort of woodland edge effect moving up into the canopy. Although you won't see that when you're planting the woodland straight away, over the next few years, you'll start to see those more sort of canopy mature tree species growing taller, starting to put the canopy on, and the other tree species forming that shrubby layer around the outside. That provides some protection internally to the woodland from prevailing winds, preventing cold spots, but it provides good bird nesting and insect areas around the edge. There's a little bit of, this was actually taken from a company's plan for woodland planting around a highway scheme. So they're talking about the deciduous and mixed woodlands, individual trees, riparian woodlands, so that's woodlands across floodplains or alongside rivers, and scrub areas as well. So sometimes we might not necessarily want to plant a woodland as such, we need to plant blocks of scrub. So we'd be using things like the hawthorn, blackthorn, hazels, guelder rose, just as the main species. So we've got these areas that are acting as stepping stones between woodlands, but providing bird nesting habitat.